We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order.
Coming up this week,
something a little bit different. In a crowded news week, we're bringing you only 2 stories, but with 3 hosts.
Katrina, Sandy, Helene. In the annals of hurricane disasters, the latest storm is looking like it might post a new high score on the leaderboard. But the response has been little short of a new low score from a creaking US federal bureaucracy.
Malcom Kyeyune has been tracking the fallout. He thinks it's the perfect example of an end-of-empire US elite prioritising foreign aid over domestic help.
Finally, not long after bombs fell over Lebanon, the Iranian bombs began to fall over Tel Aviv. And no information blackout could hide the multiple online clips of strikes.
It was fine for Hamas bottle rockets, but now that the big regional players are showing their technological hand, the Iron Dome seems more like a porcelain potty.
Beyond the he said, she said of the Israeli wars, is there something seismic happening here?
Are we in fact witnessing a massive real-time evolution in the eternal balance between missile defense and missile attack?
But first,
Hillbilly Elegy. Malcolm, last Thursday, you wrote a brilliant essay about the after effects of Hurricane Helene in North Carolina especially. The devastation has been far worse than the press has let on. It's almost a Katrina situation. Remember, there was something like mass hysteria about Katrina. There were celebrity fundraisers on television. There was massive criticism of the US federal government led by George W. Bush. Now there seems to be near silence. You wrote about this, detailing a fraction of the humanitarian catastrophe across especially rural and mountainous areas of North Carolina and Georgia in the Appalachian Mountains. But what you also did, which was quite interesting, was draw an analogy to the Chernobyl catastrophe in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and suggested that the inability of the federal government to respond in a competent or timely manner, and also their desire to hush things up and their general detachment, is quite analogous with the Chernobyl catastrophe. I thought it would be a great opportunity for you to come here and talk about this, because I do think it is very important in terms of the US standing in their world and their general capacity as a state to act competently and efficiently. So Malcolm, welcome back. Why don't you talk us through the general thesis that you presented in that essay?
All right, thank you for having me back. I wrote that essay because I have a couple of friends who either live in North Carolina or have parents in the immediate area, and they were bugging me about it. At first I thought, I live in Sweden, I don't live in the area. Why should I write about this? Also, to a European, we don't have much in the way of interesting natural disasters. It's just a storm, man. Don't you Americans have them all the time? Like, for whatever reason, you're used to it, right? But as I sort of started digging, it became clear that something else was going on. Because what people were telling me who had some connection to the area was that the devastation was of biblical proportions, because a storm like this has never hit this area in Appalachia for as long as the United States of America has been a thing, a quarter of a century. We don't really know when a storm like this happened the last time because there are no historical records. It could be 500 years ago, it could be 1,000 years ago. But the devastation not only came from the once every 1,000-year level of rainfall, but also from the fact that flash flooding in mountains is very dangerous. If you have flash flooding along the coast, what happens is that the water level will rise, and it will also rise because of the storm itself through a mechanism called a storm surge. So you could have a town, and suddenly the new sea level is 6 meters higher than it used to be. In the mountains, the sea level doesn't rise, water flows downward. The problem is when it does, it brings the mountain with it. Like it picks up these big rocks, it picks up mud, and then it just starts remaking the terrain. So mudslides can destroy entire towns, they can tear up roadways. And there are more and more videos coming out now on YouTube, which the listener can go and look for, damage from Helene. And in some cases, you have locals filming what looks like a completely ordinary riverbank. Like the water is clear, it's flowing like it's this kind of scenic, picturesque little brook with a fairly wide riverbed with like big rocks sticking out everywhere. It looks like a picture from a national park. The guy with the camera goes through the river and he finds like one small piece of roadway and points out that like this scenic natural river was a road 2 days ago. And like there are almost no signs whatsoever. There's like a piece of like the guardrail sticking out of the ground, but it's almost like all signs of human habitation have been wiped off the landscape. And that is the power of these flash floods and storms in mountainous areas. Like they're very rare because mountains tend to protect against hurricanes normally. But when they don't, they really, really don't. So that's the first thing to say about the amount of damage. The thing that became very clear, though, was that the level and quality of the response was completely different. So if you think about Katrina, when Katrina made landfall, people were prepared. According to the US Army's own official story narrative, which is kind of, I think it's been sort of massaged to not present some of the bigger problems. But basically, according to the official narrative from the army, Louisiana itself had about 10,000 guardsmen on the scene days before landfall. And they were there because they knew Katrina was going to be damaging, so they were going to help with the cleanup. After the storm makes landfall, the army gets involved in a serious way. I think there's something like 7,000 troops from the regular army involved. You also have more guardsmen streaming in. So the rescue effort was something like 25,000 guardsmen in total in Louisiana helping with the cleanup. For comparison, for Helene right now, there's about 7,000 guardsmen in total, and they weren't there in advance. They got activated after the damage was already done. There's something like 1,500 people from the regular army. They only got activated a week after the storm hit. In terms of helicopters, which is another good measuring stick, for Katrina, they had something like 350 plus helicopters from the Department of Defense. For this effort, it's less than 70. So we're talking about a response that is very different and not in a good way, both in terms of quantity, in the amount of helicopters and troops, but also in the terms of like quality. There's not the same sort of pre-planning. There's not the same sort of coordination between different authorities. This is happening in a mountainous area where towns get cut off. All the roads get destroyed. In many cases, not just destroyed, but the road has been obliterated. There's nothing left. You can't just pave it over. You have to move a ton of earth to even make a place for the road to eventually go. When you have a lot of smaller towns and villages up in the mountains that get isolated, they're cut off from fresh water, from food, they have no electricity. It's not just the flooding that kills people, it's the lack of water, the lack of medicines like insulin, and if things go on, they might even freeze to death. that terrain needs more helicopters than an equivalent area and population you saw in Katrina. It doesn't need less. The response is just really anemic. It's not sufficient, the level of disaster. It's very slow. It's being trickled in by authorities who clearly weren't prepared for this and didn't take this seriously for basically a week.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that stands out most to somebody that obviously hasn't followed it as closely as you have, and you've actually talked to people who are being affected by it. But yeah, as you say, you'd usually see something vaguely come up on the radar about a storm, and you'd go, it's a storm, it's America, it's kind of a crazy place geographically. But on the other hand, America typically, especially having lived there twice, is very focused on America. It's very noticeable when you're there, or if you pay attention to any American media. I mean, they're really obsessed with their politics, and that kind of feeds in over here because the politics impacts the rest of the world. But, you know, if you're not familiar with America and the way the media is over there, it is very contained. You'll get some foreign policy stuff here, some foreign policy stuff there, but it's really contained. And that's why, for example, the Iraq war was much more scandalous than, you know, anything that's happened in Ukraine, because it was actually Americans being sent over to die and so on. But the response to Hurricane Helene has been really milquetoast in a sense. It reminds me of something that was more minor, but I think we might, in retrospect, see as the precursor or micro Helene. It's when the chemical spill in that small town, East Palestine, in rural America, obviously that was not nearly as big as this. That's a pretty simple cleanup job and so on. But it reminds me of that. And it also, what reminds me about the Helene thing is we are actually getting a little bit more attention now after people have started speaking up about it, and after some of the Republican candidates, maybe J.D. Vance, has called attention to it. There's a spotlight being put on it, and now we are getting the... But, you know, prior to that, the media response was basically nothing. They saw it as just a storm. In the piece you go into, the dichotomy about how people viewed why the politicians and the media were behaving like this versus what the actual reality is. Why do they not care? Why is there so little attention being paid to this? What are the competing narratives being put out by various people in various places about why the lack of response is there?
That's a really central question to understand why this storm is important, even to a podcast like this, which isn't a meteorological podcast. Locals, when they try to explain why there's so little help, often say, well, they hate us in Washington. We're poor, we're Appalachians, we've always been treated like dirt. In some cases, people say stuff like, oh, they're going to try grabbing the lithium, or they have some woke DI plan to eradicate poor hillbillies, whites, or they want to take control of or destroy Western North Carolina because then people can't go to the polls, meaning Kamala Harris can win the state and then win the presidency. My impression talking to people in Washington, D.C., both in terms of the Republican political establishment, but also the uniformed military, was, no, this is not even malice. This is something else. This is senility and obliviousness. People in Washington weren't even aware this was a problem. They're slowly becoming aware at a point where the belated rescue efforts probably have killed and are killing more Americans just because they needed a helicopter to make contact to rescue the wounded and bring food and water, and no helicopter came. Basically said, well, there's 6,000 guardsmen on the scene. Isn't that enough? So there's been really kind of what the dynamic you talked about earlier, Philip, where America is self-absorbed, which is why they cared a lot about Katrina and what went wrong, and they don't really care a lot about like knowing what the differences between Sunni and Shia are in Iraq, even as they try to bring democracy to Iraq. That sort of aspect to American culture is now in a sort of hypertrophied form. You see the same thing regionally almost. Like people in Washington, they're so concerned with their court politics and the next glorious 5-year plan that anything that happens in actual America now is kind of like basically the same as something happening in a foreign country. And this also ties into one of the problems that I think people are avoiding speaking about. One of the problems with trying to mount a rescue effort today is that in terms of like practical reality, but also in terms of mental capacity, America, or at least the American elite, is focused overseas. North Carolina is home to some pretty big bases. They have Fort Liberty, formerly Fort Bragg. They have Camp Lejeune, which belongs to the Marine Corps. These have significant air assets. The problem with Fort Liberty is that the 82nd Airborne, and I think the 18th or 16th, I can't remember, I'm bad with Roman numerals, but the Air Corps that's stationed there, these are meant to be the American Quick Response Force. So if they go out to help Americans in North Carolina, you can't send them over overnight in order to help Israel attack Iran. And it doesn't really matter that no American wants another war in the Middle East. Even the support for sending weapons to Israel, that's a small minority position in American society today. I don't know what the polling is for having another war, but it is in the single digits, I'm pretty sure. It doesn't matter. These troops, they're needed elsewhere. If you have to make the choice between helping Americans and helping Israel start a war, or have Americans join a war of choice, the American elites have one opinion on which is more important, and the American people have another. And so you can't really talk about this, because if you really have that discussion, it's quite destabilizing, to put it mildly.
Yeah, so I wanted to push deeper on this idea that the US is entering a period analogous to the late Soviet Union. You highlighted the similarities between the Chernobyl disaster and what's happening with Hurricane Helene now. The major difference is that Chernobyl was very much of the Soviet Union's making. As far as I understand, it was a poor reactor design and poor practice. It was very much of the Soviet system's making. Whereas Hurricane Helene, the natural disaster. Do you want to explain why you still feel that the analogy is relevant?
Well, the thing about Chernobyl is, even if you look at the Soviet Union, Chernobyl is probably not the worst industrial disaster they suffered. Industrial disasters happen occasionally. They tend to be a lot less dangerous than natural disasters in general. People aren't necessarily mad about the tens of thousands that died from Chernobyl, because only 30 people died as a direct result of the reactor explosion. And depending on how you count, you might have a couple of thousand people who die 20 years later from leukemia, which may or may not be directly caused by radiation exposure. The problem with Chernobyl was the lying, the sense that this system didn't really have a point anymore. Like, it was just like a machine stumbling blindly forward. And you can see a very ominous rumor mill happening right now. And I tend to think that in terms of this rumor mill, where there's smoke, there's fire. But basically, you not only have the problem of, well, sure, like natural disasters happen. You know, Katrina happened, but there were 10,000 troops there, and there were 350 helicopters, and then 7,000 troops from the regular army. At this point in the disaster relief effort, you're talking about like 25% of that, where there should probably be 110% of that or something. So that in itself, the lack of response, is going to lead directly to more Americans dying than would have if there was a bigger, more high-quality response. That in itself is kind of edging into scandal territory. But there also seems to be this very worrying thing about FEMA itself. And here I should mention something about Katrina. Katrina happens at the height of the unipolar moment, and this is why, even though the US is at war in both Afghanistan and Iraq at that point, they still have all of these troop numbers and helicopters. And FEMA is criticized pretty heavily. They criticize George Bush for, well, he sent the troops 2 days late. This time, the troops are being sent in far smaller numbers, 6 or 7 days late. But also, FEMA was inflexible, very sort of slow, very obsessed with bureaucracy, very hostile to attempts to apply like unauthorized innovation to do things that worked rather than things that like benefited select contractors. American disappointment with FEMA was like an academic family and the son coming home with like a B- on a test. And the parents going, we expect you to get straight A's. Like, what are you doing? Like, you haven't been studying. The disappointment back then came from a place of national unity and pride in America and the thought that this is America, things just work here. And then they don't work so well. Not only do people not believe that things work anymore in America, not only is the country incredibly divided and sort of prone to very paranoid thinking regarding, 50% of the country wanting to come over and kill them because they vote for this party. Also, FEMA seems to be far less sort of competent on the ground, but also much more territorial in a bureaucratic sense. So right now, like the thing people are mad about is not just like FEMA being slow to accept help from civilians, which was the case with Katrina. If people go out and start rescuing folks using their own private helicopters, they might make us in FEMA look bad. And if we look bad, maybe we won't get enough budget next year to like handle all of the things we want to do and expand the office and buy a new coffee machine. So it's better if this person with the helicopter just stays at home rather than being out there saving Americans. Because if there's more private helicopters doing rescue than there are government personnel, that's just embarrassing for us. And bureaucracies are prone to this sort of thinking, and it tends to get worse the more crisis-prone a society becomes. What this behavior translates into in a lot of Americans' eyes is that the government is out to kill them. What other reason could they have to tell civilian pilots, even though there's not enough helicopters, that you can't be a part of this or we'll arrest you, which has happened. People have been threatened with arrest for not being part of the official government response and still doing search and rescue missions. So if you combine a natural disaster with a qualitatively and quantitatively poor response, which we're already at, like there's no real reason to discuss whether this is a sufficient response or not, because it's clearly not. But if you combine that with either the government being maliciously so indifferent to civilians trying to help or actively hostile, then you really have the makings of a real political scandal. At that point, you basically have a situation where the federal government is slow walking or sabotaging the actual rescue effort because it might make Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or the FEMA director look bad.
I vaguely remember the response to Katrina, not just immediately. I think everyone over a certain age remembers that. But the kind of lore that came up in its wake, especially around FEMA, the lore that came up around FEMA was of an entity that was too powerful. I'm thinking of the FEMA conspiracy theories. I don't know if anyone remembers the FEMA coffins. I do quite well. Alex Jones and the FEMA coffins. The idea there was FEMA was trying to engage in some sort of depopulation program. I remember in Katrina, they brought people into a football to hand out care blankets, and that was to categorize people and stuff like that. Okay, we can all make fun of the conspiracy theories, but the point is that it was seen as this hyper competent thing, and that all its actions were actually to array you into like the machine, and you have a barcode stamped on you. I don't see that at all this time. Now it's like, well, why aren't they doing anything? Like, why is everything wrecked? Where's FEMA? Very American, paranoid, anti-federal government X-Files conspiracy theory actually probably in a strange way supports the status quo because it maintains belief in the military-industrial complex, the FBI and the hero in the FBI. And if there's no cover-ups and it's just this kind of boring bureaucrat saying, please don't fly that helicopter because there's an election, it definitely feels this time like the emperor has no clothes, so we don't even need to be scared of the FEMA camps anymore because they couldn't even be bothered setting up camps. So I guess to kind of close on this, what would your takeaway be with respect to what this means for America? I mean, it's not going to create a DC-style political crisis, right? Because the media is effectively what it is. It's kind of it's based on the East Coast. It's based on the West Coast. They don't want to pay attention to this. They're throwing a little bit of attention to North Carolina now just because people were upset about it. But CNN isn't going to go up to the president or say, why didn't you do enough for North Carolina? I think Ben Vance and the Republicans and the Twitter Republicans will gin up a little bit of discontent with it. But no one will really be held accountable. There won't be congressional hearings or anything like that. How do you see it impacting? Is it just another poison put into the bloodstream as the whole thing gradually gets undermined from within, or do you see a more dramatic kind of day of reckoning? I guess Chernobyl was of the kind of like a little bit more poison in the bloodstream there, a little bit more disillusion.
In some ways, I think this is worse than Chernobyl, because Chernobyl was, at least, like, it was a quote-unquote honest accident. And also the state was fairly competent, like it was a system without much legitimacy, and they tried to hide the extent of the damage, but when couldn't do that anymore, they were actually fairly, like, they could still call up, 10,000 conscripts on short notice, evacuate the entire town of Pripyat in an afternoon. The state still had some actual muscles, in a way which is not the case here. The thing about this storm and these kinds of really once every millennium storms in mountain areas, in order to restore Western North Carolina to what you need a post-World War II expansion of the highways kind of industrial program, the damages for all of this is just... This is going to cost so much money, like hundreds of billions of dollars probably. And that ties into the really dangerous thing about this. The reason this is such a poisonous pill is the lack of response, but also the lack of care in Washington. It's going to prevent it from becoming an object of contention on the House floor of the Senate, of Congress. But you have senators like Lindsey Graham interviewed about this. He's a senator from South Carolina. And they're talking on Fox about what's going on with the storm. He immediately pivots to, we need to send more money to Israel during the interview, when there's still pictures of his own countrymen almost drowning in the floodwaters. And he's like, but look at what's happening in Israel. They're running out of ammo. We have to send them more. People are waking up to the fact that the empire is in such a bad state that it is doing what every empire, a couple of years before it finally dies does, which is it basically retracts all protection from its own subjects, its own soldiers, and says, you need to pay taxes, you need to do your conscription and everything. Like, this is part of the social contract, but you are not going to get anything from it anymore. Like, all the money we have, we're going to send it to foreign countries because that's more important. But we no longer have enough money to spend on you. We're going to send the 82nd Airborne or whatever to help Israel, but we can't really promise to send it to help you, even though the point of the military is supposedly to protect America and Americans. The Roman Empire at the time, when asked, like, what are the British supposed to do? He said they will have to fend for themselves. Well, that's what the US state is increasingly saying to its own population. You will have to fend for yourself. You won't get a tax rebate for no longer having the basic services of a state. Physical protection is the most basic thing a state is supposed to do. And that is driving a lot of bitterness, cynicism, and even outright hatred. You can't have a situation like this where America is basically heading towards some form of credit event. The US is just borrowing up a storm, sending $20 billion in a month to Israel and Ukraine, and then saying, sorry, we're out of money for you guys. That can't go on for more than a couple of years.
Foam dome. Last week on the show, we covered some of the events in the Middle East, especially surrounding the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah by the Israelis. That was the leader of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they dumped a bunch of ordnance over a bunker, which I assumed Hezbollah thought was secure, and they managed to kill Nasrallah. At the time, we didn't know how the situation would develop. It already looked like Israel would go into southern Lebanon, send the Israeli defense. We didn't really know what Iran's response would be. We speculated that there probably would be a response. Andrew and I were both quite confident that there would be. The Nasrallah killing was just too much, I think, for Iran to stomach. Well, we've had the response, and I would say it's one of the most dramatic events that I've experienced in the past few years, not in terms of lives lost or damage done or anything like that, but I think in terms of images, but beyond images, what it means. So what happened is I'm sure everybody knows by now, Iran fired an absolute ton of ballistic missiles into Israel. And of course, there was a Iranian missile attack back in April, I believe. It was much more limited. They were forewarned about it. Most of the stuff sent there was easy to shoot down. It was drones, cruise missiles. There was a couple of ballistics, and everyone kind of was, well, didn't they get through? No one could really say for certain. This was a very different kettle of fish. The Israelis were given very limited warning about the attack. I think the Americans were tipped off through a third party, but they only really reported it 2 hours before. I remember reading it in the Wall Street Journal as an alert on my phone, and within 2 hours I was watching videos of this. So it's quite shocking. The videos themselves, they're everywhere. There's lots of them because there was a lot of video. I mean, this really did look something out of a movie where, you know, nuclear apocalypse starts. You see all these missiles just coming down. Now, thank God they did not have nuclear tips on them. They were standard explosive missiles, but there were an absolute ton of them. There hasn't been a response from Israel yet. I don't think there will be a real response before the election, if there even will be a response. If there will be a response, I think it'll probably be after the election, because it might involve oil infrastructure. We can talk about that in a moment. But what has the attack taught us? It's confirmed what some of us have thought for a long time, which is that air defense, Western air defense, which is Israeli air defense, they can rename this stuff David Sling or whatever, but it's all the same technology the West uses, is pretty much ineffective against ballistic missiles. If you watch the videos of the missiles coming in over Israel, there was almost no interception. I listened to an interview with an MIT professor who specializes in this technology, and he's convinced that the Israelis didn't bother firing at them because it was a waste of interceptor missiles. They knew they couldn't hit them. You saw one or two interceptions, but not much. I did see some subsequent video which claimed to be over Jordan, which there looked like there were some interceptions there, and so perhaps there were interceptions midway through flight that we didn't see in those other videos. The Iranians have now proven, without a shadow of a doubt, that ballistic missile technology, relatively cheap ballistic missile technology, these things aren't particularly expensive, except for the slightly more expensive variants, which they fired a few of, the Fatah, I think it's called. These relatively cheap missiles are able to get through a Western air defense. Some people have thought that for a long time. Air defense was not actually built to defeat ballistic missiles. It was built to defeat aircraft. Air defense is very good at shooting down helicopters and even relatively fast planes. That does not mean it should be good at shooting down a missile that's going multiple times the speed and re-entering the Earth through the atmosphere. Some people who understand the science behind these things weren't terribly shocked by what happened, although seeing it in real time, having your theories confirmed, is quite surprising. We know basically that the air defense does not work. Israel does not have sufficient air defense. Maybe nowhere in the world has sufficient air defense to overcome this type of technology. I won't say that renders Israel defenseless. They can retaliate and so on. But in a sense it does. I mean, in a sense that they will have to bear attacks from now on. That much is clear. The only thing that's really, the only question that remains, I think even the Washington Post has admitted what's happened. I think they've even admitted that some air bases were struck. The West lost control over the information sphere here because of the overwhelming number of these things and the overwhelming amount of video put out. In normal times, I'd say the Western media would have much preferred, and by the Western media I mean the State Department, and they would brief the Western media. They would have probably said limited amount got through, you know, these stuff you hear in Ukraine, 95% shot down or whatever. They haven't even tried that this time because there's just too much evidence, which is interesting in and of itself. The only question that still remains is how accurate, how precise these missiles are. The MIT professor I referenced said they are only accurate within 2 kilometers, so there are things that you can throw. But also there are some videos that seem to show linear hits along an airstrip, which look quite accurate. And accuracy does matter because you want your missiles to hit on target and take out high-value targets rather than bombing a desert. But that's really the only question. I think now we're at a point where we have relative consensus that Western air defense, and probably all air defense, cannot work against this type of technology. We're going to talk about what this means for Israel, the Middle East, Iran, and so on, but I just really put that on the table there. That is a big change from a week ago. And that's a big change for the past 30, 35, 40 years. Just before I hand it over to you guys, I'll just point out the professor I'm talking about at MIT, his name's Ted Postol, has long been saying this, and he's even made the claim that he used to work for Pentagon, DOD, and he's made the claim, which is very controversial, that Scud missiles in the first Gulf War were not able to be intercepted by air defense. That even Scud missiles, which if you know anything about missiles, these are really pretty old tech that Saddam Hussein had. He said that they couldn't have been hit. And when Postol and other people said that, it was enormously controversial. And they were borderline painted as conspiracy theories for terrorists. So I just really want to get it on the table. What has happened in the past week has been an enormous shift in the narrative around weapons technology.
I completely agree with the picture you paint, but I would still level a fairly harsh criticism about your story here, which is this is only half of what we learned about the state of military balance. Like, missiles being good is only half the story, because the other side of the coin is that Cold War jet technology is absolute garbage. Like, you can chuck those jets in the trash too. Because again, this is a huge problem with Western militaries. Most people should be familiar with the whole brouhaha around aircraft carriers in the lead up to World War II, where you had a lot of naval traditionalists who said, we've always used ships with big cannons ever since, the age of sail. Like, why would we abandon the idea of just putting as big a cannon as we can on a ship and have that be the main thing a navy does? When aircraft carriers became a technology that was actually useful, what these people wanted was to have small aircraft carriers that basically served as scout planes. The big ships with big guns knew where to go and where to point their guns. Like that was the only thing they could imagine. We have planes, we can launch planes from ships on the sea, and this makes the thing we've been using since the age of sail, just updating it with bigger cannons and better armor, that makes it even better. So that's the point of aircraft carriers. And then some people realize that you can actually attack things. You can sink ships with torpedo bombers. If you can sink ships with torpedo bombers more efficiently and more cheap than trying to get a firing solution for your big cannon, you don't need a battleship anymore. We are in the same position, except much worse, with manned aircraft. This is really obvious when you discuss the logistics of Israel trying to strike back at Iran for this. Iran launched 180 missiles Some people are saying it's actually lower than that. It took 15 minutes max for the missiles to arrive from silo to impact on an Israeli airbase. If Israel wants to retaliate, it's going to take the jets something like, I haven't actually done the math here, but it's going to take at least like 40, 50 minutes for the jets to get there. The actual time is much longer because jets can't fly that far, especially if they're loaded with bombs, simply for fuel reasons. A strike from Israel on Iran is going to involve a huge line of these like aerial refueling planes, just to make sure that these slow jets can actually get to the target. And, every plane needs a pilot, a trained pilot, and those cost, tens, 50, like $20 million per pilot just in training. And so you're going to need like a really huge logistical train for like one strike to have these jets basically ferry these like 1,000 pounds, 4,000 pounds, 2,000 pounds of explosives, drop them on a target, and then need fuel on the way back. And there's going to be more, stops for aerial refueling and so on. Like, it's a huge logistical puzzle to deliver an equivalent amount of explosive force using jets. It's an order of magnitude more expensive and complicated. And if Iran sees these jets coming and they launch the missiles are going to arrive in Israel like 40 minutes before the Israeli jets even get to their targets in Iran. Trying to make these Cold War jets work, because when you think about what a jet does, it drops an explosive warhead, which usually sits at the tip of a gravity bomb or a missile, a ground attack missile. If you think about it, a Cold War jet is like a primitive and slow-moving missile with accommodations for a human to live and breathe inside it, so it can ferry the thing to the target, fly back, get reloaded, and so on. Like, we are talking about something like trying to make horse-mounted cavalry work in World War II against tanks. You can put explosive armor on the horse or a Kevlar vest on the horse, but you don't need to use horses. You can use motorcycles, armored cars. We have better technology at that point. So the entire West is stuck in a doctrinal mode where the point of having this fleet of jet aircraft is delivering so and so much explosive material to an airbase or a nuclear facility or whatever. And the way we do it costs more, is slower, more inefficient, and pilots can get shot down by air defense, which is a huge loss for any country. Like losing a single pilot, that's tens of millions down the drain. Losing a missile to a shoot down, like that's actually a victory in some sense, because generally interceptor missiles cost way more than the missiles they're shooting down. So what I'm getting at here is if missiles work, and as you pointed out, Philip, this attack on Iran, this attack by Iran shows that this is a legitimate form of deep strike from long distances away. That kind of shows that there's been a massive amount of malinvestment inside the entire West for decades at this point. For like 40 years, we've been investing in the wrong things, in a method of warfare that is inherently more expensive, less reliable in some sense, more fragile in terms of like what happens if you lose pilots. And it's basically too late to fix things.
So I guess the counter-argument to that, Malcolm, is that jets are fundamentally more flexible than missiles because they have a human at the helm. They can carry multiple weapons and multiple weapon systems. They can change course, change mission, identify targets, and pursue multiple roles. There can be, air superiority, there can be ground attack, whereas a missile is more of a one-hit wonder. But we haven't seen a single air force in recent years, not in living memory, but in recent memory, that is able to undertake the successful suppression of enemy air defense operations. The United States military, though, I think it's fair to say has that capacity. None of the European militaries do. I'm not sure the Russian military do. Who knows about the Chinese? But the US certainly do. And in the event that you were able to suppress the enemy's air defenses, to destroy their surface-to-air missiles, you were able to pop the A2AD bubbles, then in that case the fighter jets, bombers, would be even more powerful than missiles because they could range across the battlefield, they could range across the theatre, almost like the cavalry of old, I suppose, wreaking a whole range of damage that even missiles perhaps wouldn't be able to achieve in that kind of environment. While the Israelis don't have the degree of missiles that the Iranians have, they do have access to US missile stockpiles. The US would ultimately give them what they needed. But in addition to that, if they were able, with US help one assumes, to suppress Iranian air defense, then in that case the Israeli Defense Force would be the Israeli Air Force would be a hugely potent offensive weapon against Iran, because ultimately they would be able to get over Jordan airspace and Iraq airspace as well, because the US controls Iraqi airspace.
Yeah, the counter-argument to that counter-argument is fairly simple, and I think it's kind of correct or true in a pretty obvious way, which is war is about economics. If you think about sortie for an F-15E, for example, and look at fuel consumption, and you look at the maintenance required to make sure that the plane doesn't kill the pilot, because obviously, like a plane that has to have, oxygen going to the pilot and instruments and all of that things, the pilot can interact with the sort of control surfaces of the plane. All of that adds a lot of cost. Then sure, planes can do missions that missiles can't. Like, that's true. But if you're using the plane specifically to carry an explosive load of 2,000 pounds of RDX or something and drop it on a position inside Iran, that is inherently an incredibly expensive proposition that requires a massive amount of infrastructure in terms of air bases, in terms of pilot training, maintenance crews on the jets, maintenance crews and crews for the tanker, and fighter escorts for the tankers and strike package. And suddenly you're looking at something that costs $500 million for the equivalent explosives you could drop for $20 million. If you try to wage war against a country that is a peer enemy, and they basically realize that, yeah, we have a modern way of delivering explosives to a geographic location. It's called making a plane that goes really fast, doesn't have a pilot, doesn't have all of these expensive instruments, just goes really fast, and it's so cheap that we can build a lot of them. This is ancient technology at this point. These jets are 60 years old in terms of when they were designed. The reason we're sticking with them is not because they're more flexible. Like, that's kind of a cope, if I'm being honest. Like, the reason they're being stuck with is because of, if you look at like the institutional realities, and this is particularly true for the IDF, but also for the US Air Force. America today basically has long-range strike missiles, generally only in areas where you can't use a plane to do it. At that point, the Americans will grudgingly make a missile if they can't figure out a way for a manned aircraft to do the job instead, at 10 times the expense. And this is like institutional territoriality. And because like reasons of institutional prestige, like fighter pilots. And this is particularly true in the Navy. Like, if you're a naval aviator, you are like, I don't know, like a knight at a medieval tourney or something. And so, like, the conservatism of people who owe their careers to a particular piece of technology that is now, like, fairly outdated means that if you try to say, like, this is too expensive, it's too inefficient, like, look at what the Russians are doing or something, you will not be taken seriously and you will not be chosen for promotion. And if you're not chosen for promotion inside the US military, that's equivalent to getting fired, basically. Like, you can't stay. So, again, yes, you can use jets, but jets were invented in a time where they were the only game in town. And so the fact that they're ruinously expensive didn't matter, because anyone who wanted to do the same thing as you're doing would also have to pay the same ruinous expense. If we're living in a time when a peer enemy like Russia, like Iran, like China can do strike missions, essentially, like deep strike missions that are almost impossible with manned jet aircraft because of air defense. If your enemies can do that mission at like 5% of the cost you're doing it for, like America with its wrecked industrial base, and particularly Israel, which doesn't have an industrial base that could even get wrecked, it's a war-losing strategy.
Yeah, so America's going to live by the Top Gun mythology and die by the Top Gun mythology. The fact that they put out a new Top Gun film recently to big up the, classic jet-oriented strategy just kind of says it all, really. Well, we don't have a great deal of time left, and we could cover a million things about this. We also don't really making specific predictions on the podcast, except when I get over my skis a little bit after having done some data work on something. But look, Israel are saying that they're going to strike back on Iran. We don't know what that's going to look like. As I said at the beginning of this segment, I would be very surprised if they do so in any substantial way, because they're talking about oil refinery capacity and nuclear capacity. I'd be very surprised if they do any of that before the election. The price of oil is already rising extremely fast, and that's in a market that regular listeners will know I think is basically rigged and broken. The perma bears, the weird shorts in the market, are being shaken out as we speak by just complete price action already, so I don't think they'll want to exacerbate that. That said, the amount of control that America actually has over its Israeli partners is anybody's guess. I'm thinking close to 5 to 10%. But they might be able to just about hold them off before the elections, because Americans really hold their elections sacred, especially those trying to maintain their positions of power. So we don't want to make any specific predictions, but given all of what you've said about the outdatedness of this technology, and given the fact that Israel, if they are going to strike on Iran, unless they want to do a nuclear strike, which I hope we're not there yet, and I doubt we're there yet, although you might mention something about a mysterious earthquake toward the end. If they're going to strike Iran, they're going to do it with jets. They're probably going to do it with F-35s, right? So what do you think's going to happen? I mean, I'll just give you very briefly my take. The rumor is, and I think it's a bit more than a rumor at this stage, that the Russians have delivered substantial air defense to Iran. Anyone who says, oh, well, it's just Russian cheap junk, hasn't paid any attention to Ukraine. The air defense there, both the Patriots and the Russian air defense, have been able to deny flight space for jets to clearly take out the air defense before you can dominate the skies. We just see that in Ukraine. It's proven beyond a shadow of a doubt as far as I'm concerned. So logically speaking, if they have these air defense systems in Iran, which I believe they do, and the Israelis are going to try and fly these sorties against them, which are going to involve, as you say, refueling and all this stuff. I mean, I don't really want to make any predictions, but my guess would be Israeli aircraft are going to get shot down. What's your feeling?
The problem with a system like the S-400, American suppression of air defense, SEAD missions, like, I remember reading articles from like 2006. Like back then, people were discussing whether that mission was still like realistic to do, given that like there aren't a lot of new planes and capabilities coming out even for like the US Navy or something. So like it was hard to do against old systems. It was dangerous against, it would have been dangerous against the air defense of Iran in 95 or something. Like you would have lost planes. Using these modern systems like the S-400 that have a range of several hundred miles, it's very difficult. And there's an additional problem. Like the Israelis can do one strike, and they can do one strike if the Americans help them with tanker aircraft. But those tanker aircraft, unless they're being vectored in from a base like Cyprus or something, the Iranians can just hit those bases in retaliation. And again, because doing a strike mission from Israel is so ruinously expensive, like people have no idea what sort of costs we're talking about here. But I can give you a sort of idea of just how insane the American war machine is by pointing out that there were 2 American destroyers in the Mediterranean during this Iranian attack on Israel. And they fired, I think, like 6 standard missile frees apiece. These missiles that they fired in order to intercept Iranian missiles, which they didn't manage to do, but each one costs over $40 million apiece. So just sending out like 12 interceptors, which probably failed to intercept anything, that's $250 million. These are the kinds of scales we're talking about here. So Israel could probably do a couple of attacks, even if we set aside the issue of like they're gonna lose planes. But doing like an attritional bombing campaign, flying 1,500 miles and then 1,500 miles back again every time, like scrambling 6 or 7 or something like tanker aircraft for every strike, which is the equivalent in terms of explosives of, I don't know, like 50 or 60 or 70 Iranian missiles. It's self-defeating. It really is. Like, if you're fighting a war and you're paying 100 times more than the other guy for the same sort of effect in the end, and that guy is almost 10 times as big as you and supported by China and Russia, like, there is no plan here, is what I'm trying to get at. Like, I think the Israelis are basically doing a Hail Mary. Like, maybe if they attack, maybe the king they're trying to crown in Washington, D.C., like, maybe he will be able to return and proclaim a new monarchy or something. Maybe the Iranians will rise up. Maybe something will happen. But Israel cannot, for technological reasons that we've gone through here, even if they were as big as Iran, like, they couldn't, with this outdated piece of technology suit, like this outdated doctrine, they couldn't really do a war of attrition. And now they're much smaller, they have no strategic depth, and trying to pick a fight with a country that, again, pays pennies on the dollar every time they want to drop explosives over, a military base inside Israel.